Audiobook Academy. Book Summary. As I Lay Dying. By William Faulkner. Faulkner wrote As I Lay Dying in 1930, and it's one of his best-known works. Using many point-of-view characters and a narrative was a first for the genre. Each of the book's 59 chapters is narrated from the perspective of a different individual. Faulkner said he wrote the novel in 6 weeks while working at a power plant from midnight to 4 a.m. According to him, it was a tour de force and that he didn't modify one word of it. This is the author's 5th book. Faulkner's Nobel Prize in Literature in 1949 was in large part due to the success of this book, which is often considered one of the best novels of the 20th century. After their mother dies, the Bundaran family travels to Jefferson, Mississippi, where she requested to be buried, in order to honor her wish. A lot about the family is revealed through their own internal narration during the long voyage. While crossing a swollen river, the oldest son, Cash, is injured and they are forced to abandon their journey. During a mental break, Darl, the second oldest son, attempts to set fire to their mother's coffin. Darl is placed in an institution. Cash is told he may never walk again as a result of his injuries, and the mother is buried in her hometown of Jefferson at the end of the novel. Hans, the father, on the other hand, makes a rash decision to go out and find a new bride. Over the course of 59 chapters, the novel is narrated from the perspective of 15 different people. In each chapter, a different character narrates their story in a short excerpt. Darl Bundaran, the first character to speak, is the protagonist of the story. Darl recalls the moment he and his brother, Jewel, arrived at their parents' house. In the yard, they witness their father's older brother, Cash, building a coffin out of wood for their mother. The second person we meet is Cora, the wife of Vernon Tull, the rich neighbor of the Bundaran family. As Addie sleeps, she and her girls are in the Bundaran's house. The order for cakes that Cora was paid to create was cancelled after she had already cooked them, and so she tells her daughters about the experience. Kate, on the other hand, does not and believes it is unfair. Darl makes his way to the back of the home through the living room. There, he runs into his father, Hans, and his friend Vernon. When they inquire about Jewel, Darl replies that he is in the barn tending to the horses. Cash is building their mother's coffin directly outside her window, and we learn through Jewel that he believes this is inappropriate. He feels betrayed by the rest of the family for allowing him to harm them in this way. He wants he could spend the final days of his mother's life with her alone. During the next scene, he scolds his brother, father, and Vernon for their apparent desire to hasten Addie's death. But their father is reluctant to let Darl and Jewel go to deliver Vernon's package. Addie's death is on his mind, and he fears that they won't be able to get the horses back in time to transport her body. When they vow to return by sundown, Hans finally decides to let the lads go. In order to say goodbye to their mother, the boys head out. Cora is moved by Darl's loving remarks to his mother and observes him intently. Both Dewey Dell and her brother gaze on. As a result, the focus switches to Dewey Dell. When Dewey Dell thinks of Leif, a harvester with whom she had a fling in secret, she gets a little choked up. Dewey Dell is convinced that Darl is aware of this. It appears that Darl believes their mother will die before he returns, but because they need Jewel's help loading the wagon, he has decided to bring her along. As Vernon continues to persuade Hans of the importance of Darl and Jewel's journey, Hans refuses to listen. It's the youngest child of the Bundaran household, Vardaman, who returns home from school with a giant fish he hopes to show his mother. Before taking the fish into the house, he is instructed to clean it by Hans. For the night, Cora and Vernon return to their residence. Hans tells us that he believes that the government's decision to build the new road right next to his house has brought nothing but bad luck, and he blames it for his ailing wife. As Darl and Jewel say their goodbyes, Darl reflects on the time he confronted his sister about sleeping with Leif. Peabody, Addie's doctor, is the next character to appear. To his surprise, he finds Addie unable to move but otherwise unscathed. Peabody learns from Dewey Dell that his mother wants him to go. Addie is found dead in her bed that night. Even though they're thousands of miles apart, Darl and Jewel are able to sense this. As soon as possible, Hans directs Cash to finish the casket, and then instructs Dewey Dell to prepare dinner. Hans stands over his wife's body after his children have left the room and brushes her face once before departing. Even though they are thousands of miles apart, Darl and Jewel can sense it. Hans instructs Dewey Dell to prepare dinner after telling Cash that he must complete building the casket as soon as possible. Afterwards, Hans stands over his wife and strokes her face one last time before departing the room. "I believe our mother is dead," Darl informs Jewel. It is Vardaman's turn to cry as he runs out of the house in disbelief. He believes Peabody is to blame for his mother's death, and he intends to punish him. Peabody's horses flee as he beats them with a stick till they are scared. Then he pouts in the barn, all by himself. Vardaman is furious, and he storms out of the house, crying all the way. After the death of his mother, Peabody is to blame and he plans on torturing him. Peabody's horses flee as he beats them with a stick till they are scared. When he returns to the barn, he is alone. Dewey Dell reflects on her encounter with Leif and discloses that she is pregnant. She considers asking Peabody to abort the child, but he thinks she's crazy. Dewey Dell prepares dinner for her family and then heads out to the barn in search of Vardaman because she doesn't feel like eating. She's been muttering Leif's name gently to herself so that when she does come across him in the barn, she'll recognize him. Accusing Vardaman of spying, she shakes him severely by the shoulders before kicking him out of the house. After cooking dinner for her family, Dewey Dell heads to the barn to look for Vardaman. She has started whispering Leif's name to herself whenever she comes across him in the barn. Accusing Vardaman of spying, she jerks him roughly by the shoulders before kicking him out of her house. Vardaman stands outside, staring at the casket in which his mother will be laid to rest. That she will be nailed inside of it makes him apprehensive. His mother's casket stands outside, and Vardaman gazes at it. The thought of her being stuck inside it gives him a sinking feeling in his stomach. Vardaman hurries to Vernon and Cora's house, distraught, to tell them his mother has died. Vernon and Cora pick him up and take him home, where Vernon gets to work making the coffin with cash. By the time the sun comes up, they're done and Addie is laid to rest in her casket, ready for closure. When they return later in the day, they find the coffin pockmarked with holes and Vardaman sleeping peacefully next to it. In the residence of Vernon and Cora, the coffin's holes are fixed by cash. The bottom of the bridal dress Addie was buried in caused the family to place her coffin backwards. Whitfield, the town's priest, arrives to conduct the funeral services. Unce wants to make sure that Addie's last resting place is in Jefferson, as she requested. After the funeral, Vernon and Cora return to their own homes. While driving, they see Vardaman fishing in the middle of an empty swamp. Despite their assurances, he claims that his sister saw a fish in the box. Due to Darl's actions, their mother's final moments were missed, and Jewel is enraged. Because their mother doesn't exist, Darl questions how Jewel can be so upset at her. When Jewel and Darl get home, they and Unce carry the coffin into the cart with the help of Cash and Unce. Arrangements are being made to transport the deceased's body to Jefferson. Vardaman and Jewel are both still resentful that they were not there when Addie died. On the way back, they'll drop Cash off at Vernon's apartment to work with his toolbox. As a father, Unce chastises his son for behaving in this manner. As if that weren't bad enough, Dewey Dell shows up in town with a cake made by Cora. Sampson's farm is where the family finally arrives after a long day of driving. They discover that the city's bridges are all submerged, making it impossible for them to leave. For the night, Sampson provides them with a place to rest their head. Next morning, the family sets out to locate a new route over the river water. A sunken bridge proves to be no match for Vernon, who offers his assistance in getting across it safely. Observing Jewel's melancholy demeanor, Darl recalls a period in the past when Jewel started sleeping at weird hours. When he and Cash saw Jewel sneaking out of the house late at night, they suspected he was having an affair with another lady. As soon as he found out what the boys were hiding, Cash refused to tell Darl. Jewel purchased a new horse a few months later. To make ends meet for the horse, Darl's brother had been working evenings clearing ground on another property. Unce was enraged at the addition of a mouth to feed, but Jewel reassured him that he would not be responsible for the horse. Darl recalls how his mother stood up for Jewel and covered up his transgressions, as he recalls from his childhood. Rather than cross the river with the rest of their family, Darl, Cash, and Jewel stayed behind with the wagon and the coffin. They debate for a while about the best way to cross, but in the end they decide to cross with the wagon as usual. Unfortunately, a massive log slams into them too quickly, delaying or even stopping them completely. When Unce's mule drowns, the brothers are left to fend by themselves in the wagon they've built. As he stands on the sand, Vardaman is terrified that the casket containing his mother would be washed away. He screams at his brothers to hang onto it tight. Even though he is asleep, Cash manages to make himself to shore. All that washed out of their wagon is being collected by brothers Unce and Tull. While all of this is happening, the focus changes to Cora, who can't help but think about Addie. She recalls a religious discussion she had with Addie. That Addie had more faith in her unappreciative son Jewel than in God was a source of concern for her mother. She recalls that Addie referred to Jewel as her cross and her salvation in a manner more appropriate for a religious person discussing God's word. Addie's monologue follows next. Nothing in the novel ever makes it clear whether or not she is supposed to be communicating from beyond the dead. Before she married, Addie worked as a school mistress. When they misbehaved, she had a great deal of fun flogging them. Her thoughts then turned to aunts and their rocky courtship, then their marriage. Cash and Daryl's mother describes how having her first two children, Cash and Daryl, took away all of her privacy. During this period, her marriage faltered, and she began an illicit relationship with Whitfield, the town's priest. That someone who professed to be so pious could indulge in such a depraved act just made her more disillusioned with her own virtue. Jewel was born as a result of her pregnancy with Winfield's child. After this, she gave birth to Dewey Dell and Vardaman for months and viewed their lives as a final payment in her emotional due to him for being unfaithful. She then recalls some of Cora's statements regarding salvation and sinning, and she thinks of them as useless and void of any value. Whitfield makes a last-minute decision to visit the Bundrens and tell aunts about his long-running affair with Addie. He figures she'll want to confess to herself on her deathbed, so he's going to be ahead of her and do it before she has a chance. It turns out that Addie Bundren has already died and the house is deserted when he arrives. That's all Whitfield thinks, and he leaves the house with no recollection of where he came from. Daryl lays Cash on top of their mother's coffin so that the family can continue their journey in the wagon that has been battered by the rain and the hail. Armstead's residence is where the Bundrens arrive. Because they are staying with Armstead, they want to sleep in his shed. For the sake of the horses, Jewel forgoes his dinner to tend to them. In response to Armstead's offer, Aunts denies the usage of his mules. Only a veterinarian can help Jewel in her search for the doctor, Peabody. Cash's fractured leg can be set by the veterinarian, no matter what. The pain is so great that Cash has to be revived. When Aunts gets up the next morning, he rides his horse into town to inquire about purchasing a team of horses from himself. As the buzzards circle about his mother's coffin, Vardaman refuses to let them get close enough to get his mother's coffin. A team of horses has been purchased by Aunts that night. Cash and Jewel's horse were traded for the money he needed to buy false teeth, as well as the money he saved for himself. Astonishment fills Jewel's eyes at first, but his eyes soon glaze over with rage, and he rides away on his horse to prevent it from being sold in for something else. The transaction is in jeopardy if the horse cannot be acquired. On the other side, the next morning, Aunts receives the horse from the farmhand with whom he made the agreement. That he found it on his land, he tells the occupants of the house the family set out for Jefferson once more, this time without Jewel at their side. Vardaman keeps an eye out for more buzzards as they pass by in their car. The family makes a pit stop at Matson, where they rest and shop. The narrative is taken up by a shop owner named Mosley. Seeing a young woman in his shop, Mosley approaches her and asks if she needs any help. Dewey Dell, a young lady, indicates that she's trying to get an abortion, and Mosley becomes a little twitchy. He refuses to treat her because he is a religious person. As Dewey Dell recalls, Leif told her she could get an abortion for $10 at the drugstore. In response to Mosley's continued denial, Leif suggests that she marry Mosley. Mosley's helper tells him more about the Bundren family after Dewey Dell leaves. One of the boys was reportedly seen buying cement for his brother's broken leg that day, while the father had an altercation with the town marshal about his wife's stink earlier in the day. To make a cast, Daryl stops the wagon in front of a house and asks Dewey Dell to walk up and ask the homeowner for a bucket of water to use. Dewey Dell readily agrees. Cash's injuries are causing him to bleed to death. With the help of Dewey Dell, Dewey creates a cast out of cement for Daryl. Jewel reappears and silently re-enters the vehicle as they continue. The family decides to spend the night at another property that evening. Using an apple tree as a backdrop, Daryl arranges the casket. The heat causes Cash's leg to swell. During the night, Vardaman and Daryl go out to inspect the coffin. Moving it into the barn is a precautionary measure. Later, Vardaman sees Daryl setting fire to the barn, and he intervenes. When Dewey Dell asks Vardaman about what he witnessed, he tells him to keep it to himself. The fire spreads rapidly due to the dry heat of the night. To observe the fire and Jewel's efforts at freeing the animals from the barn, everyone gathered around. He returns to retrieve the casket if he is successful. As the coffin is taken back to the apple tree, Vardaman glances over the charred remnants of the barn. The amateur cast has turned Cash's leg black. Breaking it open is what Aunts tries to do. The fire has also taken a toll on Jewel. In spite of their injuries, the family decides to travel to Jefferson the next day. A doctor is recommended to treat Cash's leg before the burial of Addie that day. Cash, on the other hand, maintains that he can wait. Asking for a shovel from a neighbor is an unusual move for Ans. Soon later, the family buried Addie. The night before, Cash and his father had agreed to put Darl in a mental institution, according to Cash's tale. The family who had loaned them the barn to use is now threatening to sue them if they don't have Darl committed because they know he started the fire. They have no choice but to comply. Darl was taken away by a man from a local facility that morning. Despite his best efforts, they are able to subdue him thanks to his family. In the end, Darl lets out a roar of laughter and falls to the ground. Toward the end of the novel, we're shown what happens to the characters in a few different perspectives. Despite Peabody's treatment of Cash's leg, he says that the man may never walk again. An gorgeous young woman walks into the Jefferson drugstore, and McGowan, one of the employees, notices her. As she requests for an abortion, he pretends to be a doctor and gives her a pill. McGowan identifies the young woman as Dewey Dell and encourages her to return later to see him in the basement of the building. Meanwhile, Vardaman waits outside on the curb for her to finish. Vardaman follows her from the store to their hotel, whispering under her breath that it will not work. In a mental facility, Darl screams obscenities at himself. His psychotic break proceeds, and his narration shifts between the first and third person. After discovering that Dewey Dell still has $10, Ans implores him to lend it back to him. Though she forbids him, he takes it anyway and leaves the hotel. The next morning as the family prepares to return home, Ans comes back with a set of new false teeth. Cash remembers the night before and how his father spent more time than he considered necessary in the house borrowing the shovels. When Ans comes back he is accompanied by a stern-looking woman. Ans introduces the woman to his children as the new Mrs. Bunderan. Despite the fact that Addie Bunderan is deceased for the majority of the novel, her character has a significant impact on the plot. The novel's narrative is sparked by her desire to be buried in her hometown. Cora's recollections of Addie are woven throughout the narrative to create a distinct voice for the character. Although clever, she seemed to be dogged by a sense of disillusionment and discontent with her life, which she expressed in her writing. When she is unable to love her spouse or her children, she feels her marriage and motherhood to be worthless and hollow to her. Since the birth of her second child, she has expressed a desire to be buried apart from her husband and children. Addie's only real joy in life appears to be the kid she has with Whitfield, Jewel, and the brief romance she had with him. After her death, he shows sorrow for the way he treated Addie when she was alive, but only when he wants to be near her and saves the coffin from the burning barn. At the age of 9, Addie made the prescient prediction that Jewel would save her from the water of the fire. To put it another way, she gave up everything she had in order to pursue a love that only truly blossoms when she dies. Death and burial have divided and harmed her family just as much as Addie had done during her lifetime. In many of the important events that occurred following Addie's death, there is a sense that she is still alive. A few examples include Vardaman cutting holes in his mother's coffin so she can breathe, and a scenario during the fire where Darl informs Vardaman that he can hear their mother speaking from her coffin. Some people along the way to Jefferson commented the smell of rotting corpses, including that of Addie. A major premise in the narrative is that Addie may still be alive and watching her family's efforts to bury her, even after she has died. Darl Bunderan is the closest thing the novel has to the main narrator. In 19 of the novel's 59 sections, he serves as the narrator, making him perhaps the most introspective character. Darl's beautiful descriptions and thorough analysis serve as a guiding force in the work. While Cash and Jewel are able to perform heroic deeds, it is his intellectual nature that keeps him from doing so. Darl expresses his displeasure with the family's voyage twice, as though he has strong feelings against it. By setting fire to his mother's coffin twice, the first time when the wagon broke down in the river as he was trying to dump it. Darl's introspective nature also causes him to feel isolated from his peers. Almost everyone in town thinks Darl is unusual and out of place, as Cora points out early in the book. When he discovers Dewey Dell's affair with Leif and later guesses that Ans is not Jewel's biological father, he shows that he is also capable of perceiving the private secrets of those around him. Even though he and Jewel are miles apart when Darl feels Addie is gone, the narrative shows him to be extremely prescient at times. It is implied that other characters avoid Darl out of concern that he may find out their secrets due to this uncanny skill. The other characters are revealed to shun Darl because of his strange ability to find out what they are hiding. Ultimately, his family decides to put him in a mental institution because of this dread, rather than because he set the barn on fire. When the asylum guards come, The first person to restrain him is Dewey Dell, who is aware that Darl has found her secret pregnancy. Jewel Bundoran. Jewel has comparatively few narrative sections throughout the book, and because of this he is mostly defined by his actions as viewed by other characters rather than his words. This gives readers and reviewers of the book a lot of room to argue about his behavior. Throughout his narrative portions, Darl frequently refers to his brother as Wooden, and it is from this description that we learn not only that Jewel is impenetrable to the other characters, but also that he shares some of the impenetrable properties of his mother's wooden coffin. It's also questionable whether or not Jewel reciprocated his mother's affections while she was still alive. His treatment of her while she was still alive at the start of the narrative comes across as harsh. Jewel refuses to say goodbye to his mother even as she is dying. Even after she died, Jewel's behaviors suggest that he cared for her. To get her to Jefferson, he gives up his beloved horse, which he had saved for a special occasion. Despite the heroic nature of his efforts, Jewel's attitude toward his family is icy. For example, when he continues to seek for Cash's tools on the riverbed after the wagon is overturned, and when he nearly comes to blows with a stranger who he believes has insulted the family. Jewel, on the whole, is a sturdy man of action and little words, which puts him at odds with Darl, a more contemplative character. Vardaman Bundoran, the youngest of the Bundoran children, Vardaman is perhaps the most undoubtedly upset about his mother's passing and shows it most openly. In order to alleviate his mother's suffocation, he drills holes in the coffin and pretends to be a gravedigger. We can't say for sure if Vardaman's affection for his mother is due to his mother's kindness in treating him differently than she treated his elder brothers, or if it's just the natural affection of a kid. Of all the characters, Vardaman continually exhibits the most likability and innocence, and he is shown to be an inventive and inquisitive youngster throughout the novel. Dewey Dell Bundoran, the Bundoran's only daughter. Dewey Dell is 17 and a recent affair with a local boy has left her pregnant. However, she is determined to get rid of the pregnancy and spends the majority of her narrative parts thinking about how to do it. Even during her narrative, Dewey Dell's reserved character obscures her feelings and we never learn what she genuinely desires from her current predicament. That's all we know for sure. She's trying to keep it a secret from her family and the rest of the town. Ans Bundoran, the father of the Bundoran clan. However, when he says farewell to his wife, harsh and callous farmer Ans displays some tenderness by stroking the skin on her face. Ans, on the other hand, is driven primarily by self-interest for the most of the story. For the most part, the protagonist is consumed with finding a replacement for his wife's missing teeth. Most of his children's problems may be traced back to his ineffective fathering, and they all seem to regard or despise him in some way. He was one of the greatest American novelists, most known for his 20 books that depicted the fight between the Old and New Souths in America. When Faulkner was born in September of 1897, he was raised in Oxford, Mississippi, as the oldest of 4 boys of a well-known Southern family. After he dropped out of high school in 1915, he went to work for his grandfather's bank. He enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force during World War I but was never deployed. When he returned to Oxford, he enrolled in the University of Mississippi as a veteran student, but he quickly dropped out to focus on writing full-time, making ends meet through odd jobs. Faulkner's first book, The Marble Faun, was published privately in 1924 and contained a collection of derivative poems. His debut novel Soldier's Pay was published in the following year, after which he relocated to New Orleans, where he worked as a journalist, 1926. After a brief trip to Europe, he returned to the United States and began writing the Yoknapatawpha County novels, which are set in his imagined Mississippi. Among the town's inhabitants were members of his own ancestors' tribes, African Americans, hermits from the woods, and a ragtag group of whites. Faulkner's debut novel, Sartoris, was published in 1929, followed by The Sound and the Fury, which established him as a master of fiction. He married his childhood sweetheart, Estelle Oldham, in the same year and settled in Oxford, a small town in the Oxfordshire countryside, to raise their 3 children. Only one of his books, Sanctuary, sold well, despite positive reviews for many of them, 1931. The success of the novel led to a prosperous career as a Hollywood scriptwriter. Afraid that Faulkner was not well known or appreciated, critic Malcolm Cowley compiled The Portable Faulkner in 1946, assembling excerpts from his works. After this, Faulkner's writings, which had been out of print for some time, were reprinted. No longer were his works considered to be solely a product of his own difficult South, but as literary masterpieces that transcended his own region's angst and struggle. In recognition of his contributions, he received the Literature Nobel Prize in 1949. Until his death on July 6, 1962 in Oxford, he continued to write novels and short tales. When he passed away from a heart attack, he was laid to rest with his family in the St. Peter's Cemetery in Oxford. In recognition of his contributions, he received the Literature Nobel Prize in 1949. Until the day of his death on July 6, 1962, in Oxford, he continued to compose novels and short tales. As a result of a heart attack, he was buried with his family at St. Peter's Cemetery in Oxford. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.